Hey everyone, welcome back to Life Unpotted. Thanks for joining us today. Today we're joined with our new friend, George Poulos. We just met George recently. He also lives in New York City, and we saw his posts online, and we really resonated with the topics he was talking about. So we figured, let's bring him on the pod to chat. This is our in-person chat, which I think is really awesome. George is sitting here with us in our little studio we got, and I'm excited for that because I feel like there's something special about being in person with the collective energy and, you know, feeling that as the conversation unfolds. So I'm definitely excited for today's conversation. So George, thanks so much for joining us.
Happy to be here.
We were just talking about before the show, your spiritual journey and the process of coming to terms with who we are, whether that means relationships or jobs or our everyday life. And I would be curious to hear from you on that process of having a spiritual awakening. What did that look like? What did that feel like? What was the catalyst? And yeah, what was that process like for you?
Big question.
Big question. We like to start off with the biggest question.
Start off with the big questions.
So I remember my life used to be very much based in like hard work and achievement and school and grades and then being successful in my career. I'll leave it at that. And then I was really anxious. Like I was successful after college, but I was really anxious. That was the catalyst. It was like a lot of anxiety despite having hit the benchmarkers of success, right? So then I went to a therapist for the first time, and the therapist recommended I read Eckhart Tolle.
Good therapist.
Mm-hmm. So I read Eckhart Tolle and I thought it was like super corny. And then I canceled with the therapist because I thought that the solutions to my problems would be similarly calculated and controlled to how I had lived my life, right? So I just like dismissed the whole thing, but seeds were planted, and that was like the very beginning.
So you felt like your therapist was like recommending to you another structured approach that would kind of replicate the life you've been living, and you didn't want to go down that path?
No, I thought it was like too like woo-woo. Like Eckhart Tolle, I was like, I mean that, but the book, The Power of Now, is like, it literally says over and over and over again, like, just be here now. Like, just bring it back to the present. Just be present. I was like, this is not it. Like, there's no way that's it.
I think it's been really interesting on our spiritual journey of, you do hear things like that, like just find yourself here, find yourself in the moment. And what I've learned is that it's a lot more complicated than just that, because you really do have to delve deep into questioning the idea of who you thought you are. And that's not something that you can just really do overnight. Like for me, that's been the past 2 and 3 years of questioning and healing. And that's been a lot of crying and journaling and really unlearning all these habitual ways of thinking. So that makes sense why you'd think that way, because I feel like it's easy to summarize this process down to just let go and be here now, but I don't know, I think it's a lot more than just that.
I think it's interesting because now I think Eckhart Tolle is right. Like it is just about getting to the present moment, but because of how ingrained we are into our societal ways, you can't just like, it's very unlikely that you'll see the words be here now and just suddenly wake up, you know, like it does take, there is more of a process.
Right. Like, yeah, we were talking about that in last week's episode of when you have this awareness now, when you've done the quote unquote work of healing is the preferred word I've used. You do get to a point where you can, especially with meditation, you can pause and say, I'm going to breathe. I'm going to take a deep breath. I'm not going to fall into these thoughts. But I think that the whole process, that's much, much harder to do at the beginning stages when you have not done any questioning or have any awareness about this process at all.
So I think it's really relatable that you picked up Eckhart Tolle a few years ago and we're like, this is so corny. I could relate because I think when you're in that state of like, I'm going to go throughout the process of achieving in a rigid manner of a process-based experience, like how a lot of us do, it's all coming from the mind. It's all based from the mind. And when you read Be Here Now from the mind, you're like, well, okay, I'm here now, whatever, check. So a book full of that, it doesn't make much sense. It's not that deep. It's cheesy, but I'm sure you've revisited it and have changed your opinion on that a lot, because when you read Be Here Now and you feel it and you are out of the head, out of the mind, you view it differently. And it takes a lot of work before you can even look at Be Here Now and understand what that means. Because you can look at it a billion times and it's going to mean something a little bit more depth each and every single time. And I think that is half the battle of understanding, of having awareness of yourself and of what things mean that you read. They can only go deeper and deeper and deeper. And I think that's kind of like the iceberg of getting out of, like, that's the tip of the iceberg, getting out of the mind by understanding how can I perceive the world not within the mind, because that is the trap.
Yeah. And it's tough, right? Because like when you've lived your whole life in the mind, where does that first moment come where you snap out of it? You know what I mean?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
I don't know if I can really recall when that was for me. I think it's a slow, gradual process.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Slow burn.
Slow burn. It is a slow burn.
Well, I feel like it's like when you've been running on autopilot your whole life and you have, like, up until the age I turned 25, which is a few years ago, I never knew what it meant to not think out of scarcity or reactivity or out of fear, or out of worry. I was just finishing reading Untethered Soul, and he was talking a lot about, Michael Singer was talking a lot about how that, like, the pain body is what has governed our life up until the point that we start to wake up. So it's so interesting we talk a lot about on the podcast, it's like, how do we talk to people who haven't woken up to get the wheel spinning, to start them thinking about, oh wait, I actually don't really want to live the way I've been living. And for me, I think the first process was being like, I don't like my life at all right now. Like, I don't like how things are going. I don't want to do this path. I don't want to do any of this. And I feel like with, suffering, if you will, it kind of puts you down the path of, if I don't like where I'm living right now, there has to be more to this life. Did you have like a similar experience?
Yeah, I think that is the pivotal point we were talking about. It's like that point where you've explored enough of the way you've been doing things and you're not satisfied. And then something snaps where you start to take a look inwards. And I guess for me, it was that anxiety that led me to try the therapist. Right. And the therapist's recommendation didn't click right away, but that was like a turning point where I was starting to look at things differently and starting to seek different solutions, I suppose.
Were you generally like just anxious about everyday life, or?
I mean, I would say like my whole life I was anxious about the next step. So high school, thinking about college, thinking about work. Then I ended up having a YouTube channel. So it was video after video stressing about what I was going to do for the next video, how I was going to maintain the income, etc. So it was like this hamster wheel of worrying about the next thing.
Yeah, I feel like that's the classic wanting mind of always wanting the next thing. And I think that's something I still feel like, even though I've done all this work, it's never going to, I don't know if it ever goes away, but I think you're able to like start to recognize it.
Which is huge. If you have awareness of a toxic pattern that you're putting yourself into, that's like a major, major step. There's like much less suffering involved when you're kind of at a bird's eye looking at the mechanism that you're getting yourself into, as opposed to just being in it and really, really being anxious. It's like there's a different quality when you're like, okay, I see myself thinking about the future and becoming anxious because of it. There's like a little bit more peace in that perspective.
It's interesting because, I mean, I think when you're on this process, you kind of get hooked on this one thing brings all the clarity. I think right now, like just everything you're saying, it's just making me think so much about how we do spend our entire lives in our minds. We think so much about every little thing we're going to do. And it's almost like you're deemed woo-woo or out there if you start to operate in a way that is more vibrational or is more, I don't know if vibrational is the right word. That's just the first word that came to mind. But you're just not thinking so much. Like we're in a culture that is so obsessed with, how much have you achieved? But I wonder if this is a generational thing, if this is something that more people are becoming aware of because of the mass media, of how things have allowed like power and perspective to go back into the hands of individual people, because that's always where like the collective power is. It's within each and every single person. And I think, step one might be realizing it's not in the mind. Okay, next is realizing that whatever is in my body, whatever is in my soul, whatever is in my spirit is within every single person. So how does every single person recognize that within themselves? And I think just by operating at that point in reality that you know that there's no difference between you and anyone else, that helps other people see it. Because anything you do, anything you wear, anything you think, anything you create, of course the ego is important in the realm of understanding that, okay, like I feel passionate about this, but where's the line of being passionate and proud of something and realizing that it's really no different than what anyone else could create, you know? Because it's not taking it too seriously, but it's finding that thing that makes you feel good. Because I know you mentioned you read The Artist's Way, and I've talked about that a little bit in the podcast. And I think what that book really talks about is helping you tune in to understand what is going to help you tap into that thing that doesn't feel like work. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what it is. I think it's not necessarily what you're doing, but how you're doing something and why you're doing something.
Yes.
And as you were talking about how you became a YouTuber, and then you've taken, I mean, if you looked at it through the realm of living in New York or living in the society of what is untraditional, you've decided not to take a traditional path. So I'm curious of what that has looked like for you, because of my experience of realizing I don't want to work for someone. I want to do something, not even that I don't want to work for something, I want to do something that doesn't feel like work. So I'm curious of how that has looked for you, since you didn't have the kind of that, like, I hate my boss moment.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's really interesting, right? Because I was in college on more of a normal path. I was studying computer science, and I was expecting to work in software engineering because I thought I needed a job that made a lot of money, right? But something started budding inside of me in college, and I started my YouTube channel. So I had this... something was brewing inside of me, this natural creative urge, but I didn't fully escape the trap. And I built a YouTube channel that was really based on, I guess, just this same thing of chasing success, right? And so because I was giving up the normal career path, I was really anxious, and I was like trying really hard in a very stressful way to make sure my YouTube channel was successful. And I did it. And I hit it, but I wasn't totally at peace. Like I was still, it was weird because I had like created a non-conventional career path for myself, but I was still very anxious and stressed out, almost as if I was in a corporate job, right? So I didn't have the boss draining my energy, but I was draining my own energy because I was still in the rat race, right? So then it took a long time, and The Artist's Way helped me a lot So my boss, you could say, was like the YouTube algorithm, validation from other people, making sure I hit a certain amount of views. I was like basically a slave to these things in my own mind. So my creativity was not flowing out of me. My ego was constantly thinking about, how do I create the right thing to make sure I hit these specific validation markers? The Artist's Way helped me drop the output, drop the consideration of the output, and just allow, right? Like we all have a creative drive inside of us that if we get the ego out of the way, it wants to come out, right? So that was a long process. The Artist's Way helped me a lot, but I've started to get my ego out of the way and have just allowed things to come out. And from the outside, it's like, you could see me, I'm still working hard and hustling in a way, but now it's actually not effortful. It's actually just a flow. It's just coming out.
I think that's incredibly fascinating, honestly, because when I left my job a few weeks, I guess a month ago at this point, I had this kind of recognition of, I was not working, and I felt that same habitual pattern come up of, it's 9:30, I have to start working, I have to start doing all these things. And I think this point is so, so, so important to make, because it's so easy to be in your job or be in whatever situation. You think that, okay, when I leave this job, I'll finally be happy. I'll finally feel like at ease and I can relax. And for me, like, I had the recognition I didn't want to be in my job, honestly, like 5 years ago, but really, really started to have it was 1 year ago. But it's almost like I needed that point. I needed this year to learn about myself, to build this tool set, to understand that when I leave my job, my mindset will still be there. I'm just ridding one external factor. So I think that's so interesting, the analogy to draw of like the algorithm is your boss, because it's always going to be something else. And I think in life, I'm like really having a realization right now, honestly, of like, there's always going to be something. It's always going to be something. If you're a podcaster, well, how do you not get caught up in the analytics, right? If you're an artist, how do you not get caught up in people not liking your artwork? A musician, same thing, and so on. So while I think it's so important to listen to your ego, while I think it's so important, well, your ego sometimes, I think we can't get rid of the ego. We need it. That's where it's not a completely get rid of. That's a whole nother topic, conversation. But I think it's so important to recognize that it's all internal, this process. And I think that's something that's really, really hard to break through. And it requires a lot of work, in my experience, we're not going to go down this path right now. We're not going to go down this path of I'm worrying, I'm judging, I'm anxious, I'm insecure. So that is so interesting. And I really would love to hear more about your experience of kind of like transitioning from the algorithm is my boss. I'm caught up in the same habitual pattern as I was caught up in, in college, worrying about my major. And then how did you find yourself breaking free from that so that your mind was no longer controlling you, but you were able to enter into the flow state and now work in a way that you are able to work every day in such a calm and manner of there is no urgency anymore?
So, right. It's like you touch on something big there, right? Because you can't just, so if you're in this pattern of, oh, I need the promotion and the next promotion and the next job, and then you might hit a point where it's like, oh, I need to quit my job, but you're still doing the thing where you're putting a benchmark in the future. So that's the kind of thing when you quit that job and you realize you're still not quite fulfilled in your soul. That's the kind of thing that can push you to a spiritual path. So I think my process of expecting the YouTube channel to bring me like supreme fulfillment, that's what pushed me to the spiritual path. The universe gave me the artist's way, and the artist's way gave me a practical mindset to start outputting my truth as opposed to calculating, right? So there is a process of like practices. One of them is the morning pages, right? So you open your journal and you allow your hand to move without thinking about it. You just let the words come out without your control, right? So that's a little practice, but as you do that more and more and more, your creativity starts flowing out just like it flows out of your hand in the morning pages in bigger and grander ways. So I just started to watch this all happening and all changing. And it was a long process, and my ego threw a lot of like fear tantrums and like
sounds right.
Yeah, like I was really scared to let go of the skate videos, and I was really scared about what was going to happen to my income, and are the brand deals going to go away? What am I going to do? All these fear-based things, and they got me several times, and I would go back and make a skate video, but it started to become more and more hurtful in my soul to do the things I didn't want to do. So I really just fell onto this natural path of like, okay, it just really feels good to let go and to just actually do what I want to do.
That is so interesting, your journey of you were doing something you were passionate about. You're passionate about skateboarding, but the way you were doing it, you said, was calculating. It wasn't letting go. It wasn't sharing your truth. So it's one of those things where it's not just about following a passion. What's more important is just letting go and sharing your truth and the means of how you communicate it and what the expectation is. And I really like with the artist's way, what I've taken away from it. I've only read a little bit of it, but I understand what you mean when you say like creativity is really at the core of everything that we do. Play is at the core of everything that we do. So I'm sure when you were looking at your skateboarding, which I'm sure when you first started skateboarding in your life ever, it was for play, it was for fun, it was for challenge, and it was for excitement, and you fell in love with it. And then you took it and you made it a business. And making something a business doesn't always mean that it's going to go wrong. Doesn't necessarily mean that, or it's going to take away the fun, but it's the way that you look at your productivity. And what I think about creativity is so powerful. If you get into a state that you fully trust and you can fully play and let go of all these things, when you merge those two things together, it's like you can have business through creativity. Like I said, I've said this before, I don't know anything. I don't have any experience with this, but that is kind of what I'm learning, is that the power lies within no expectation, no calculations, because when we started this podcast, it was so calculated. We started talking about our relationship, and it was like,
because that worked. That was working on social media, and I was like, oh,
but it was soul sucking. It was horrible.
It wasn't what we actually wanted.
And by taking a break,
but it was the vehicle in which that got us to the point that we need. And it seems like skateboarding, I mean, who knows what that'd be, but in some way that was the vehicle for you. So I think we all kind of have those vehicles in life of something that's, we have to learn from something, right? So I think it's like, you kind of have to have a process of getting caught up in it. Because if you don't get caught up in it, how can you ever get out of it? Which I think is like an interesting thing in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
You're absolutely right. It's like you can't just out of nowhere do everything perfectly. You have to make the mistakes, and in that way there are no mistakes.
One of our first experiences with truly letting go was when we took mushrooms last year at a retreat, and it was like I think honestly it was the first time in my life where I comprehended this idea of, you know, I've had a lot of anxiety when I've, you know, with weed in the past and substances in the past. And I had to fully conceptualize in this moment that it wasn't the substances. It was always just showing me what I needed to look at. And I think that is the craziest thing, to have that recognition. And we both had that recognition at the retreat. And I was like, whoa, there's a lot of stuff down there that I haven't looked at before. And that was like a crazy, crazy moment, because I think for the first time I was like, I need to look at this stuff. But the only way to do that is to let the stuff rise and for the stuff to come up. But I think in that moment, it was the first time I conceptually, and I guess, like we say, this goes beyond concepts. It's not something we can conceptualize. I like felt what it meant to let go. And that was to trust, you know, when we were doing mushrooms, that it was really scary and I had no idea what I was going to expect. But that we came out on the other end of it feeling amazing. So did you have any similar experiences with psychedelics, with any sort of substances that helped you understand what it meant and what you physically felt like to let go?
Yes. This is very beautiful. I think that practicing psychedelics in like a spiritual way, it is a parallel to everything, right? So if you can surrender to the psychedelic, and I experienced this, I've done psychedelics like 5 times, and I have significant experience every time. And I remember I like read How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan. That was like my guide to using mushrooms for the first time. And what I took away from that is you have to surrender to the experience. If you're afraid of what it's going to show you, you're going to keep all that stuff you mentioned buried down. It's common that you might start to feel anxious and afraid as you're starting to come up on mushrooms for the first time. Right. But because of what I read in that book, when I took mushrooms for the first time and my heart rate started going up, I just started paying attention to my heart rate. Like I just looked at it in the face instead of freaking out. And right. So that's a beautiful parallel to life. Like our ego is going to be fearful of many things. If you look at it in the face, you might just transcend that fear and this world is going to open up. And that's exactly what happened the first time I took mushrooms. Right. So lots of fear starts coming up. I look at it, and the more I pay attention to it, the more it dissipates, and then it opens up into this beautiful trip I had. The first time I took mushrooms was a pivotal point on my spiritual journey because I was a skeptic until that point. And then on mushrooms, the main thing that I remember is like I saw my thoughts in physical form outside of my body, right? So like I was like, okay, I'm not my thoughts, right? Like I really understand this now. So then after that, I was on like a much more serious journey of meditation and trying to understand myself.
That sounds really powerful.
It was.
Did you feel like, well, I mean, I think having that experience, it's so easy to say we are not our thoughts, we are not our thoughts. And I think recently I've started to fully embody what that meant because I feel like the space has opened up to recognize, I know when I'm thinking out of the fear. I know when it's the fear talking, and I know when it's my intuition, when it's the love talking. But I think it's a matter of like opening up that space to realize that it's there. And as you start to do it, you start to connect with this part of yourself that you didn't even know existed. I never knew what it meant to really love and believe in myself. I never even knew what that meant. Sure, maybe I was like confident person throughout my early 20s, but there was so much deeper than that. So I think it's so interesting. And I was so scared of psychedelics too, because, and it's so interesting how like we have fear and so much resistance towards the things that actually might help us. And obviously that goes back, you know, to the war on drugs and everything that happened and how mushrooms were classified in the way that they were. And it's so interesting that like, it's almost like, and it goes back to what you're saying Daisy earlier about things that become woo-woo, things that become weird. And it's almost like the collective fear in society, collective resistance of, do we subconsciously not want to wake up? Like, it's so interesting to see how that manifests, because it's like the things that actually help us the most are not getting promoted, are not in the consumerist cycle. So, you could obviously go from the skeptical higher level conspiracy theory of like, okay, the government's out to get us and, we're in a simulation, whatever you want to call it. But it's interesting that it really takes, you don't know what's best for you. And that can even go to something that is illegal, like psychedelics, right? Obviously they're becoming more mainstream now, but I just think that process is so interesting of like letting go of your own resistance to that, to even get to the place of entering that gateway to even see that you had resistance to it in the first place.
Yeah. It's like the inner revolution. I think in a way the society does collectively resist awakening, and it's because, right? Like if I think about where I was afraid, right? I was afraid to open my mind and to see things differently. So that fear is amplified on a collective level. So there is a push to get rid of things that will wake us up because everyone is afraid in a way, right? But if you can break through that yourself, then this whole world opens up, and it's really incredible.
It's what is it? The idea of there's a price to pay to have freedom, and it's facing the fear. And I think that can be looked at on so many different spectrums. But I think with my personal opinion on mushrooms, I was that person my entire life that was like, oh, I would never touch that. I would never do that. Even like when we started listening to Joseph Unity, where we did the retreat and did the mushrooms, I was like, I don't know. But then I slowly started to have my mind change, because I realized there is a metaphor for how you live your life with taking mushrooms. And that is, it's a visceral feeling of understanding what it means to face something. You understand what it means to viscerally go directly at what is scaring you, and taking that practice out into everyday life. It's like diving deep into the triggers. It's like diving deep into the actual pain. And it's interesting how spirituality is so tied into healing, because as human beings, we are so fragile and things happen to everyone, and that accumulates and that becomes our identity. And I think the thing with mushrooms that's so scary is it kind of makes you open up and face those things. But in a way, those beliefs have to die. And if death is our ultimate biggest fear that we have, little parts of us dying is kind of second best to our fears. So, and we were talking about this on a recent podcast, where if we're able to look at the biggest question of all of where do we go after we die, and getting comfortable with that, it's like everything else is going to get a little bit less scary, because it puts it into perspective of, okay, I'm just here. I'm just here right now. Back to your Be Here Now from your book earlier. Mm-hmm. See, it has a whole new meaning. But it's such a gift. And I'm even just from saying that, I'm like viewing it differently of, oh, okay, this doesn't mean that I have to get all caught up in this little bullshit. So I just think that it's such an interesting way to, you can't be narrow-minded. There's so much more to this life than what we're told. Oh yeah.
Yeah. I think maybe the fear that we feel about a lot of things generally probably does boil down to death or mini death, like ego death. And it's like the ego is so attached to these things that make up our identity. And an experience like mushrooms will make you realize that you are not those things. But since the ego is so attached to those things, that's where the fear comes from. It's like this feeling that you're going to die if you realize that you are not your accomplishments, you're not your relationships, you're not even this body, you're not this costume. There's like something deeper, like feels like a death, because we're used to identifying our entire being with external things.
Yeah. No, I was thinking about this recently because I was reading a book. I forget what book it was, but it was talking about this. And I started to imagine, I was like, it's easy to say like, oh, the things I have, I don't identify with them. But it's like, what if you were stripped from, literally, if I was stripped and I was on the street and I literally had nothing, would I be, what?
Like in Fight Club.
Yeah, right. I burned my apartment down subconsciously. How would I really feel then? Would I be as comfortable in my skin as I think I would be? Would I be as confident as I am now when I'm able to dress myself in what I like? because that's where it really made me start to question. I'm comfortable with myself, but there is still an attachment to the identities in my life. So I think an interesting test is to think, what if I literally had nothing? And obviously there's a level of it of like, I want to be able to take care of myself and I want to be able to provide for myself. But just for the example, if I was able to let all of that go and all I had was my internal self, how would I feel? Would I feel like I didn't know myself?
I just want to follow up question kind of on that before George responds. I think this is like a really interesting thing to think about and contemplate. We live in the city and we do have apartments and we are surrounded by a lot of material things. And it begs the question of, you know, the monk who goes and reaches enlightenment from going to India and embarking on this process of literally shedding everything that is you. So what do you think about like the process of shedding your identity and the layers, doing that in a space? Is it harder to do that in somewhere like New York? Is it not? Because is it ultimately a matter of your willpower and how hard you want it? Like, what do you think about those two different concepts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be an individual heart calling. I think the issue is the mental attachment to external things, right? So like, if you are tying your identity to your apartment and then something happens to your apartment, that's going to create a little freak out. But if you like, there's a way to be at home wherever you are, right? And I think it can, if you're a materialistic person and you're surrounded by material things in a city, it may be difficult for you to realize that these things are actually nothing. I think certain journeys might bring you to India to find out, right, that you are so much more than that. But in my case, I think all I needed was a couple mushrooms trips. And now it's like, okay, yes, I live in an apartment. Like I have this podcast, I have these relationships, I have these things, but there's so much less mental attachment. I think that's the key thing. And then you can enjoy things without attaching to them, right? Because everything's going to go away, right? So if you can just enjoy things and allow them to go away when their time comes, it's more of a dance in the present, right? Instead of an anxious attachment. Like I need this job, I need this apartment.
Yeah, that's a good point. Because it is always the question of, okay, if I'm on a spiritual journey, should I not care about anything? And that's, I think, a dark portion of, well, that can't be true. I'm here on this life. I should enjoy the nice things. I want to have the nice things. I want to experience and have other people experience it with me too. But the key, what it seems like, and I agree, is that if it went away, I'd still be okay.
I think it's like, honestly, it goes down to like the subconscious manipulation we have towards everything we do in our life. And it's kind of like, even to the point of I'm in a relationship because I need that person to cure my loneliness, or I need that person to cure all these things. It's not like you could never be in a relationship, but when you learn to be in a relationship not needing that person, I think that's kind of like the analogy to draw with this. It's like, you can have that nice car if you want it, but you know that car is not raising your value. You know that car is not completing you. And I think, like you said, George, is like, you can enjoy it more then, because you don't have that fear and that anxiety attached to it. And you're like, oh, well, my car, you know, something happened to it. That's okay, because that doesn't change who I am. It's so interesting. I think it was Eckhart Tolle in the New Earth, where he was talking about, you know, your car gets, something happens to your car, but something happens to, like, if my car gets, something happens to it, but something happens to George's car. I don't feel any emotional attachment to what happened to your car. Why? Because I'm not identifying with your car. So it's like, when we're not as attached to these external things, we really can enjoy them more. And I think, Daisy, like you said, that's a really interesting point of, like, in the spiritual journey, I've gone back and forth with, like, when I first started, I was like, I don't want anything. I want to, like, go live in the forest and I don't care. But that was me just really figuring out that, no, it's not that I don't want anything. I just don't want my life to look like the way it is right now. So I think it is a process of figuring it out. How can I form new relationships with the things I used to have in my life? Doesn't mean I need to get rid of them, but I just need to switch up the way that I'm interacting with them, I guess.
Yeah. Okay, I have a few thoughts. One, just to continue the car analogy. Like, if you're really attached to your fancy new car, like, you might end up leaving it in the garage more often because you're afraid of denting it, right? And it's just, you're not even enjoying it, right? It's just this mental attachment. But if you just accept what is, and you're not worried about the future, and you're not worried about your attachment to the car, you'll go out and enjoy the car, right? So I think that's a nice analogy. And then I've had this crisis about whether I should move to the woods as well. And
very relatable.
Gateway.
yeah, that ended up pointing me to this, something you mentioned earlier, that everything comes down to the internal state of your being. And I realized that to move to the woods would be to run away from my attachments, to run away from things that are triggering me, right? Being in a city, there's so many relationships, so many different dynamics, so many material things, so many attachments and entanglements,
Challenges.
right? So, and these are all things we can work on. One way is to go to the woods and ignore them, potentially pushing these things down until some situation in the woods somehow brings up an entanglement, which I think it will eventually, because these things don't just disappear. So it's like, I've kind of seen living in a city, being in a material society, as like a fast track, as like an advanced course in like working on yourself and like cultivating inner peace, like in this chaos, you know?
I think that's a great point. I think that there's so many triggers. I think just for example, when I first moved to New York, like I would hear, I have an adversity to noises. I hate them, but I've learned to deal with them. But when I first moved to New York and I would hear like a siren that, you know, like in New York City, like when you feel like they're following you and it just keeps getting louder and louder and louder and it's really slow, a slow burn, I would thought my heart was going to I thought I was gonna have a heart attack. I would like freak out. And now I hear them, I'm just kind of like, okay, well, can't do anything about it. But it used to be a huge trigger to bring up things of like everything. And I think that's one of many. But I think ultimately when it comes down to testing yourself, you're right. You can't just run away from your triggers because that's not doing yourself a favor. You have to bring these ideas back into society because at the end of the day, like you want to participate in society. You want to be able to reap the benefits of society. And you also want to have an impact on society. You can't just run away. It's selfish to think that, oh, like I'm just going to protect myself and be safe. Well, that's kind of exiting the journey in a way.
Yeah, I agree. I'll add the caveat that I feel like there could be individuals whose heart callings is to go to the woods, right?
True. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we're leaving the city. So it's not like you have to like keep yourself somewhere.
We're not going to the woods though.
Not going to the woods. We're going to another city, a smaller city. But yeah, I agree. Your true calling could be to do something that's not revolved in the city, but you shouldn't move out of the city if you want to be in the city for that reason.
Point also being there's not one way to do this journey.
Oh my God, absolutely.
It can look
not.
so many different ways and so many different people. I think one of the things that I've been almost mind blown by recently is that how easy it is to not recognize that, you know, I'm 29 right now, that my whole life has shaped how I view the world. And because I've questioned so many things and peeled back so many layers, I realized that I was living on autopilot my life and I didn't know that, you know, we're talking about triggers, like so many things trigger me or have triggered me. And I think I'm at this point now, like what we're talking about is like using all those triggers as an opportunity that like there's something I still have to look at. And I do want to ask you this because it's something I've been pondering a lot of with triggers and with learning not to react to them, right? Like, okay, a trigger of mine is editing on Adobe Premiere Pro because like I was doing it earlier and all of a sudden this like stress response came up for me and I was like, I need to sit with this. So I got up and I just moved my body a little bit. And what I'm really pondering now and trying to understand is that like these feelings are always going to arise. They're always going to come up. So is it a matter of simply like we talk about in meditation, like just being aware of them and then with time they start to, you know, get more silent, or should we always be trying to learn from them? Like, should I now reflect later today about what happened earlier? Or, you know, where is this balance of like, I'm going to try to let go. I'm not going to try to let these things control me, but I feel like it's easy to also get caught up in the like, I'm addicted to self-improvement. I'm addicted to, always needed to analyze everything happening in my life. Oh, wow, I reacted like that. Oh, that means I'm still caught up in my mind. That means I'm still anxious. Means I still care about people think about me. So, like, do you think it's a balance of falling back in between those two?
That's a good question. I don't know what the right answer is.
There's no right answers on this podcast.
I'm at a point where if I get triggered, I go into deep curiosity mode. I'm like, what is this about? And I think there are more serious examples and less serious examples. Like I think of relationships. When I think of getting triggered, I feel like relationships is the main thing, right? So it's like, let's say your partner is out doing something and you start feeling jealous and anxious. That's a big one to look at, in my opinion, because it's like, what is this tendency to want to control this person, know exactly what they're doing? Why can't I let them be free? To me, this indicates something important to look at. And where I'm at right now, it's like, I don't know, it seems like every single thing that gets me triggered, it's like, that's a big scale. It's like, okay, tendency to control. That should be looked at. But even down to the little things, okay, getting triggered while I edit, it has to be pointing to something. So I don't know. I think where I'm at on the path is like looking at every single one. I don't know if that's an overcorrection. Like if that's, should I be landing in the middle somewhere and taking a chill pill? Yeah. Right now I'm looking at every single situation.
It's so, I love that you said you approach it with curiosity, and I feel like I just envisioned there being like 10 buckets, if you will, right? Like, I'm scared of abandonment. I'm scared my future's not going to work out. I'm scared that people won't like me. I'm afraid of things going bad, afraid of not having enough money. Like, it's almost like in all these triggers, we can kind of conceptually understand that they're all going to be rooted in maybe one of the 10 buckets. 10, I don't know, maybe it's 100 buckets. But like you said, control. Okay, that's a huge one. So it's interesting, like within the spectrum, like, control can be up here, and then below that is like, I don't want my partner to go out. And below that is like, well, because I don't feel loved. Below that is like, because I never received that love, as a kid, or I got bullied. So it's so interesting that, like, I don't know, it's like you can examine this to every degree though. And I think I'm realizing this now, where it's like, I am, in a way, I feel like I'm like reshaping completely the way I interact with the world. And that's why it feels like, I said to Daisy, it's like almost like, I feel like like I'm like going from like being a caterpillar to a butterfly, in the sense of, it is this like growing pain too, of like, I am completely changing this idea of who I am, not just about what I want to do in my life career wise, but simply in a matter of like, what do I do? My heart races when I miss the subway. So I don't know, it could feel overwhelming to realize that there's a lot of things in life that trigger you. And it almost feels like the more I go down this process, the more things are triggering me, which I think that is such an interesting too. It's like things are more heightened now. And I feel like it's almost like I have because I have like, almost feel like it's like I'm an open wound. I'm not pushing anything away. So that's a really interesting part of this process too.
I just thought of something. When it comes to triggers, a lot of them are rooted in fear, or fear of something. And I was listening to this talk with Tara Brock, where she was talking about, she hosted an exercise with people, and she had everyone write down what is your biggest fear right now, and everyone put it in a bucket, and then like everyone they mixed up the bucket, and a few people drew out different fears. And what everyone kind of realized is that no one's fears were any different, and it didn't even matter what the fear was. It was just the act of fearing something, and it was kind of depersonalizing what fear is, because at the end of the day, it's not necessarily what you fear in particular, it's the concept, it's the feeling of fear that gets in the way. So I think going back to your question of what you asked George was, well, I think there's a time and a place to examine it and to go deep into it, and then there's a time to be like, well, this isn't that deep to me. Like, it's not attaching to your identity to it. It's just realizing that this happens to everyone, and it's just part of it. So maybe I don't need to examine this right now because I'm clinging to it by examining it.
I like that.
Thank you.
Well, I feel like, because I think what just came into my mind immediately, it's like, well, uncertainty is what you can boil down everything to. But I think that's exactly the point. It's like, we're not fear. Like, we're not.
Yeah. Like, okay, to advocate for my point, now that it's a debate, like, why should anything trigger us? Like, why? Like, no matter what it is, like, why can't we accept it and respond with love?
Because our own preconceived notions are getting in the way of our ego, our identity, protecting ourselves, I think.
Right.
So if you can let go of that, or if you can just put that aside, then I think that's where you're able to see things as they are, or take the other person's perspective.
I think we almost think, this goes back to the whole thing of, we think life should be hard. Like, and I've had a realization recently, I'm like, whoa, like, life doesn't have to, like, I think suffering is really resistance. And I don't know. I've like struggled with this topic because I'm like, okay, say I was living in a country where there was a war going on, right? And we visited Israel last summer, and we did meet with friends who were like, we have to go into bomb shelters. So I do recognize, and we've talked about this too, the privilege of feeling like we do have the time and the space to contemplate these topics, contemplate all this stuff, whatever circumstances that are happening in our life that have got us to the point that we can do that. So sometimes I'm like, oh, like, do I really understand it? Like, I've had things happen in my life, like situations the past few years that was maybe the first time I really experienced like what it meant to go through like a traumatic situation. But in my upbringing, I never experienced anything like that. But I know for Daisy, it's different. So I think we all have different, I think it's almost kind of like this, like comparing trauma, comparing like, oh, my life was harder, so this is harder for me. What do you think about all that? And I know it's a very like complicated topic.
Yeah. I don't think that's helpful. I think we all were given stuff to work with. And like all we can do is work with that stuff. Something I think of is like the Buddha. He pretty sure had like a wealthy lifestyle and ended up renouncing it all for his like journey of awakening. And if you think about the Buddha, like his vibrations are still reverberating tremendously, right? And spreading peace and joy and love into the world. But what if the Buddha was thinking about world hunger, right? Or war? Then he would not have gone the journey that he went on. And I think Ram Dass speaks a lot about this too. When you think about service and how do we help the world, there's a way to do it with your ego and there's a way to tune in. And I think for me, like not comparing the trauma, like not worrying too much about if my upbringing was so privileged helps me just work with the stuff I've been given, right? And worrying so much about all the world's problems and other people's problems could be my ego trying to calculate the right way that I'm meant to grow and help. And that could be getting in the way of the universe's plan or where the intuition is guiding me to help, right? So that's kind of the take I've settled on for now. But I know it's sensitive.
I think that's a really, really great take. I think
it's a great take.
It's the reality is just focusing on what is in front of you. And that's it. I mean, of course, everyone has different things, but I get what you mean by getting caught up in, am I being politically correct? Or, am I doing enough? Like that can consume all of your time. That can consume all of your energy. And that could just be your ego being like, I don't want to upset anyone.
Is that just another fear then?
I think so.
It's so interesting. Like in that moment, you don't even understand that like the ego is doing it again.
Well, it's really interesting because if you start over calculating, I have this much privilege, therefore I should act in these ways and I should check myself. Your service and your actions are in this weird way selfish because you're trying to feed your ego. You're trying to make sure you're doing the quote unquote right things. When you surrender the ego, like your love and creativity starts moving in its natural pattern, right? And I think it's natural for that natural output to be of service to the world, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I think it's in a society, it's almost like where you don't want to say, it's like it's almost wrong to say that, or if but that's just your ego saying it's wrong to say that. It's no one else, but it's just the same as when your ego tells you, oh, you're going to go to a debate, using your example, like you've never won a debate, you're going to be stupid, you're going to be horrible. And then you go up and you win the debate. It's no different than your ego telling you you're bad to your ego telling you like you don't deserve this because you can't have access to it. So I think that's a really fascinating take on it because it goes back to, is that in a way giving you something to cling to make you feel better? And is that really worth your time?
Right.
It's a realization for me.
I want to ask, so it's like on everything we're talking about, it's like so much about letting go of everything about who we thought we were. What is your stance on the concept of enlightenment? And like we've asked this to a prior guest in the past, and I guess my stance is like that's something I'm trying to understand now, is like, will I ever get to a point where things don't trigger me? I notice that the reactionary gets more quiet and it's not happening as habitually. But I feel like it's interesting because we're talking to you right now. I'm like, oh wow, George has it figured out. So it's so interesting. It's so easy to perceive other people being like you have it figured out. It feels like you have it figured out. And then I'm constantly judging myself too, even if it's on a habitual, even if it's like a more subconscious level, it still happens of like, I still judge myself. Like, I don't know what I'm talking about. I don't know this. So I guess it's a two-pronged question of like, where do you stand on the concept of enlightenment? And I guess tying into that, where do you feel like you are in your life right now? Like, do you feel like you're still working on stuff? Is this a lifelong process? Is it I'm checking off, I healed when my ages of 5 to 10, moving on to the next years? Like, what does that process look like?
Yeah, that's very interesting. And it's almost like the concept of enlightenment can only exist because we've gotten lost through our conditioning, right? So I kind of see enlightenment, or the journey to enlightenment, as the process of deconditioning, right? And I don't know if it's necessarily important that you get to a point where absolutely nothing triggers you and you're 100% at peace. I think reaching the point where you can be aware of whatever is happening is pretty significant, and I think that's where I've gotten to. So I wouldn't say I've reached some sort of pinnacle, but no matter what happens, I'm aware that I'm aware, right? So there's situations can get me worked up, but I'm still sitting back there and I'm like, oh, look at that. I'm worked up this time,
So you feel like most of the time you're able to find yourself still in the observer seat observing.
I can find awareness no matter what, but that doesn't mean that I don't get tangled into things. And for me right now, it's like usually in relationships. It's like, I don't know, those interpersonal attachments are very tricky.
They're very tricky.
But there's a part of me that's watching myself working on these entanglements, right? So it's very interesting.
Well, it's almost like you're watching yourself, and just because you're aware of what you're doing, it doesn't mean that you can necessarily stop yourself from doing it. Maybe you're not quite there yet. You're like, oh no, I've done it again, but I might do it again, but I'm aware that I'm doing it and that I don't want to do this.
Yes. So I think of like conversations in my relationship with my girlfriend, and a lot of the times I'll be like, I'm triggered right now. I'm going to say something out of my ego, right? But it's like I still have to say it. So I'm not all the way there somehow, but at least, I can say it and then be like, okay, I see this thing that my ego just said. It's not nice.
No, I've
Sophie says that.
Yeah.
Oh, really? Cool.
Yeah. Well, it's like, I know I don't identify with this, but I need to express it. So it's almost like understanding that this is not what I really feel, but it's still coming up. So I think it's interesting. It is about, I think we still do have to continue to express. You're laughing.
I have a good example for this.
Okay.
It's quite funny. So I'm going to use Sophie as an example, because Sophie's biggest trigger is clothes, like getting dressed, not finding the right thing.
This is true.
This is an old shirt. I've only worn the, you know how it goes. And it was probably a few months ago, and you went crazy. And then like 5 minutes after, we were just like laughing because you were just like, that was bad, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And it was kind of like, even like in the process of you being dramatic, it was like,
but you know what?
It's kind of funny that you're doing this.
You know what I
were aware
notice
of that.
now? It's like, I almost can't get as mad as I used to. And sometimes I'm like annoyed about it. I'm like, you know what? I want to get mad right now. But I feel like I find myself being like, I can only get so mad now because that awareness, like, so I guess I understand what you're saying now. It's like that awareness always is there now. It's harder to slip back into, I'm completely feel like I'm unconscious or on autopilot the way I was like 5 years ago.
Yes. And then, you think about when you say like, what is the goal of enlightenment or what is enlightenment? My brain also goes to like the peak of a acid trip or a mushrooms trip. And it's like, is that the peak? Like, are we supposed to be that integrated into the truth that like we're seeing colors and like seeing people's auras and energies? Maybe. And like Zen masters, like they don't even really communicate in proper words. They're like smacking each other with sticks because the truth can't even be expressed in words.
It's not conceptual.
Right.
Yeah. Like I read something recently, I think in the Course of Miracles, that words are symbols of symbols, right? Like words are referring to something which is a symbol of the deeper truth. So it's twice removed. It's like, so I think the goal is like, I think deeper than we can even really conceptualize.
What do you feel like happens in reality on an energetical realm that we can't see?
What do I think happens?
like I remember when we took mushrooms, our like everything was like kind of moving, and I remember one of our friends was like, "That's because everything is moving." So it's like I don't know if you've like studied this or anything, but from a like physics standpoint of like, what is the percentage of reality we can even perceive? I forgot. I think it's very small.
Mm-hmm. I see. So, okay, I think, here's one thing I'll say. I think my theory on visual hallucinations on psychedelics is that they're always there, but we've trained our perception to be very, very narrow. So I think what we're taking in on a regular basis is extremely narrow. It's not even close to what's actually happening.
What is actually happening?
I'll say some words, see what comes out. I think it's
That's all we can do, right?
I think that there's some sort of, I have this image in my head of like there's a projector out there somewhere projecting these bodies, but what's really happening is up there in the projector. It's like this intermingling of love and energy. And I think what's happening here is just like the projection of whatever is happening up there.
Up there being
the projector,
right.
The source of the light,
right?
Something like that.
So
that's cool.
The universe, everything collectively.
Yeah, I don't know.
Do you feel like you're at a point now where like we're sitting here right now that do you feel like there's division between us, or do you feel like you're at a point now where you can recognize like, do you feel like everyone is you and unity exists everywhere?
I think that I see both at the same time, because our bodies are here and they appear to be separate, but obviously there's some sort of energetic intermingling, right?
It's so interesting that we can't see the energy.
Yeah, we can't see it with our narrow perception that's coming in.
Yeah, that's interesting, the energy. I know, going back to Tara Brock, I was listening to her today, and she was talking about, we get so caught up in, like, this is like a random example she was using of, like, what we eat and how that makes us look. And there's, like, a rise of anorexia and bulimia, and we're so obsessed with how we look that we forget about what is inside. And there was this exercise that she was doing of, like, okay, feel your hands and feel the energy in your hands. Okay, now feel your feet, feel the energy in your feet. Feel your thighs, feel the energy in your thighs, and same with your stomach, feel the energy. And before you know it, you've tapped into that energy. And people wonder, how is it possible that we heal ourselves through meditation, we heal ourselves through these mediums? It's because everyone has a healing energy, because that is what is connecting all of us right now, is that healing energy. But 99.9% of the time, we are not tapped into that. So I think that's something that I'm kind of starting to think about and starting to wonder and ponder upon is, how do we tap into that more consistently? Tapping into it, into yourself and feeling it. Because, and maybe a meditation will help you get more intensely into it. Like, I've done 15, 20-minute meditations where I do start to feel like all these little things in my hand and these, I don't know how to describe it. It's energy. But it's something that's so powerful, and becoming more aware of that is what allows us to realize, we are all connected, I think.
I like that.
I think, yeah, I have a few last minute questions before we close out the episode. Maybe I could just ask you them. We could do like a little fire round.
Okay.
First question I have is like, do you think that we really are limitless beings, meaning that we can all do whatever, we can achieve whatever we want, and the only thing that holds us back is our own fears?
Yes.
Are you scared to die?
No.
Why not?
Okay, I actually thought of this while you were speaking about the feet energy. So I can't remember where I first picked this up. I think it was Sam Harris, because I started meditating using his app.
That was how I started Waking Up app, like
Cool.
5 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. So he would once in a while recommend really paying attention to the sensations of the body. And he would recommend trying to realize that there's not, like, your awareness of your foot is this like abstract sensation of energy coming into your consciousness. Right. So I started to over time apply this to my entire body. And I've had meditations where I like suddenly felt like this floating orb of energy, and like I was separate from my body, but aware of the body. So that started to make me feel like I'm not the body. So that was a big step in eliminating my fear of death. Then Osho helped, because just he wrote something along the lines of, okay, you're aware of your days passing by. Whatever happens, you're aware of it. Eventually, you're going to die, and you're going to be aware while you die, right? So it cannot be you that is dying. There's a phenomenon of death that is happening, and you're going to be aware of it. So it cannot be you that's dying, right? So that clicked something in me that has largely eliminated my fear of death. I'm not going to say it's like gone, but it helped a lot.
What do you think? Is there a purpose to life?
Is there a purpose to life? I don't know. I mean, I think right now my purpose is to cultivate presence.
That's mine too.
Yeah.
I like that.
And I think in presence, an intangible purpose can be felt.
What is your biggest insecurity? We don't normally do these fire rounds, but I like it.
They feel quite natural.
My biggest insecurity probably has to do with like relationship attachment.
Seems like a lot of your stuff goes back to relationships.
Yeah, that's been a big vehicle for me.
You learn a lot about it's the biggest mirror.
Yeah. I would say my biggest insecurity probably is that I'm like inherently unlovable or something.
Yeah.
I think that's what the relationship stuff all kind of points to.
I totally I've experienced that.
Yeah, same.
I know Daisy has too.
Yeah. Yeah. Entirely.
I feel like we could
100%.
talk for like 8 hours on this topic, so
I know.
we have to close it out.
We'll close it out. George, this was so great.
Yeah.
This was such a good conversation. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah.
And I'm so happy we did it in person. It made all the difference.
Me too. Yeah. Good intermingling of energies up in the projector light.
Projector light, yeah. Yeah. George, you want to give a shout out where I know you got your Instagram, you got your merch.
Yeah. My podcast is the George Poulos podcast, Poulos, and you could search it on Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere. And I have merch at georgepoulos.com.
Nice.
That's good.
Definitely go check out George. We're listening to his podcast. He has some great stuff on there. So thanks so much for joining us, George. And just a reminder to everyone in the community that tomorrow we'll be having our community Zoom. So if you have not registered yet, feel free to do so. Link in bio. Until next time.